So today, we have this sort of odd little passage from Matthew and the 4th of July, which at least on the first look seems to be completely sort of disassociated from each other, right? But when we dig into it, you can see sort of where they attach. So let's first talk about a misconception of how we think history works. Because I think history, as a student of history, someone who loves history, we get it really wrong when we tell the story of history, right? Because the way most of us learned history was that there were great men who raised up and either created great times or raised to the great time in front of them, right? And then you tell stories. It all starts off with, there was one day a man named Winston Churchill, or there was one day a man named Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, right? And then you start your story. So it makes it sound like there was nothing before this man, whatever that man be. Okay? It sounds like all there was before this guy comes along is a problem. And that this one person stood up and decided, I'm changing this problem, and then did. That's how we learned history. And yet that's not at all how history really works. Right? It gets two big things wrong. The first thing it gets wrong is that all those struggles, no matter which one of those historical characters you're talking about, there were people struggling about it before that person existed. Right? Civil rights struggle had gone on for generations and generations and generations. And will morphed and changed and had different players and different people, whether you're talking about the abolition of slavery or you're talking about trying to fight Jim Crow or the integration of the military. There's a whole history long before MLK and after. When you talk about the struggling of freedom in Europe, there is a long history before Winston Churchill and after, right? He is none of those people are the beginning or end of the book, and none of us are either. Because history keeps marching on before us while we're here and afterwards. We're all part of a story, an unfolding, continuous story of God's world, ever becoming more the kingdom to come. And while there are great people who do great things and they should be honored, we fool ourselves if we think they're directing history. The other thing we miss is that many of these great people didn't start off trying to be great. Many of the great movements aren't because someone had some grand strategy of the world and then began to enact it. Most of these great people of history that we learn about start off simply wanting to give someone a cup of water. Simply wanting to do something small. And that small thing takes off. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. He was a pastor of a moderate-sized church in a moderate-sized town. What did he want to do? His goal was simple when everything started. All he wanted was that the indignity of going ahead and having to sit at the back of the bus could end. It all started as a bus boycott, right? In one town, in one place. And yet, fighting for this one small thing turned into the modern civil rights movement we know today, right? Long before George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, even before the Sons of Liberty in Boston and the Boston Massacre, if you keep turning that dial back in history, you will find what's called the Loyal Nine. Feel free to Google me if you don't know who I'm talking about. There are 9 people somewhere around Boston who decide one day, by the way, most of them are distillers, they're making alcohol, decide one day in a bar, which is highly appropriate, that they're going to go ahead and start meeting, because last night in that bar, when they were all having some beer, they started talking about politics, which is a real dangerous thing to do then, just as now. And so they started talking about politics, and one of them says to the other one, you know what really annoys me? We keep getting all these taxes, and we have no representation out there. And they say, you know what, that annoys me too. And the other guy says, you can't say that too loud. If the Crown hears you, they will hang you. And they said, well, hey, Bill, you're a journalist. You have that back room, right? Let's go talk about it back there tomorrow. It is from this Loyal 9 in Boston that they create the Liberty Tree, decentralized authority among the Patriot movement in the US, which is key to them not getting shut down by the British. They also came up with a term called no taxation without representation. You might have heard that slogan. Those 9 did not set out to have a revolution. There's a reason you had to have the Sons of Liberty, and from that all these other groups. Those 9 wanted to overturn a tax, or at least get to vote and lose the vote on the tax. We have all their manuscripts. On one sense, yeah, they all turn out to be revolutionaries who fight for the Continental Army. On the other hand, when they met in that back room that next day, that was not why they got there. They just wanted better government that was more responsive to the people. The environmental movement we know today, okay, no matter what you think of it, I think we can all agree not having rivers that catch fire is a good thing. If you don't know what I'm referring to, look at the history of Chicago. You know that started with one woman. And I'm not talking about Rachel Carter. That's where everyone says it started. No, there's a woman named Olga. We don't even really know her last name. What we know about Olga is that Olga lived somewhere in Massachusetts, and she was looking at her backyard, and she loved feeding birds. And so Olga goes ahead and writes the Boston Globe and says, hey folks, every year I watch all these birds come to my yard and eat at my feeders, and every year there's a little less of them. Am I doing something wrong, or is there something really bad going on that I don't understand? Rachel Carter, the writer of Silent Spring, will read that article from one woman just posing a question in her local newspaper that will lead her to write Silent Spring, which will lead to the modern environmental movement that we know back from the 60s to today. See, when we talk about handing a cup of water to the littlest of us, what God is reminding us is that we are called day in and day out to go out there and do good. Because we never know where we fall. That modern environmental movement started by Rachel or Olga would not have happened if there hadn't been tons of local community groups working to figure out what was wrong with their streams, with their water, with the lead pipes, with the lead gas we used to burn. The modern civil rights movement would not have happened if there hadn't been thousands of people over hundreds of years struggling and often feeling like they failed and not even knowing that they were successful. The thing we're celebrating today would not have occurred had 9 guys not named a tree Liberty Tree down in Boston. They had not met that night at a bar and decided to discuss some politics and figure out what is better for everybody. See, when we go out and we do good and we do what God is calling us to do, sure, you always run the risk you are the spark. And you'll get mentioned in some future sermon somewhere, and that's great. But we don't do it for that. Because most of us, most of the time, not the spark. We're not going to be part of the Liberty 9. We're not going to write Silent Spring. We're not going to go ahead and be the next MLK. But what we can do is be part of the echelons of people that precede the next spark, that prepare the ground, till the soil, whatever you want to look at for your analogy. Because without those who till, planting is useless. Without those who cut down the trees and build the pile of wood, fire won't catch. Without that work each and every day, it takes longer for God's world to come more and more into being. So as you go out this July 4th, ask yourself a simple question. In what way can I do a small thing for my neighbor, for my community, for my world? Not in hopes of being the next great prophet or the next great righteous person, but in simply hopes of making the world a little bit better, a little bit more godly. a little bit closer to the kingdom to come. Amen.